Absolutely. So welcome to the Agile Strategy Meetup group. My name is Morten Elvang, and it's my pleasure to host this. And we had a bit of an intensive period in the first quarter of 2025. And after that peaked off, I was inviting the world to please offer your contribution. And actually, Dennis, you were one of the very few, if not the only one, who accepted that invitation. So that's really appreciated. And I remember our introductory call where I would basically describe the atmosphere as two peas in a pot on how we were conserving. But I will leave it for everyone else to discover. So warmly welcome. I hope you will introduce your topic yourself for anything you want us to know. And just about the formalities, we will go 30 minutes presentation, and then after that we will have time for whatever we want to spend it on. And we will aim to end at the full hour to respect everybody's time. So Dennis, really great to have you here. Please take us away.
Yeah, Morten, thank you for the opportunity. Let me get my desktop sort of set up here. So for the last, it's interesting, half the people on the call are people I actually know. Brian and Giardino we've worked together in the past. I have another friend who I think is going to join us. Hopefully we'll get a few more people as the call goes on. But for the last 20 years or so, I've been involved in large scale agile transformation. So, hey, Gina. And been working on actually making software organizations deliver. I think in the last 20 years, we saw this big inflection point around the collapsing of silos in all the areas in Agile that led to the Agile movement and was a significant contributor to a lot of value created in the last 20 years, 25 years. I believe that we're starting to see the same sort of convergence of distinct disciplines around strategy and strategy execution beginning to collapse together because of the speed that technology, organizations, markets, competition are bringing to bear. And so what we're going to start to experience is what does it look like for us to have an integrated agile strategy sort of makeup. So I think it's very interesting to explore the idea of what did it take to get agile to work? What does it take to get agile strategy to work? And I'm going to spend some time defining agile, some time on agile strategy. And then I'm going to give a model that I'm calling built to adapt. I'm going to give you some of the elements of that model that I think are necessary to build organizations that actually are designed to execute strategy. My path to this place is sort of interesting. I'm not a strategist. I've been doing large scale transformations, and before that, large scale software development and rollouts. I helped Microsoft build their business architecture practice so that we could do large scale services-oriented architecture work. Several of the people on the call have been involved in agile transformations or SOA transformations with me. So it's been very interesting, but I've developed a worldview sort of grounded in the synthesis and integration of disciplines, drawing from what actually works and produces value. I'm not a big academic. I'm not a big ideologue. I sort of believe that what works, and we need to get underneath why they work so we can apply them more consistently. So I basically believe that I design systems that shape outcomes rather than prescribe them. And I understand how to develop those systems within constraints, because you can't design systems and ways to go work that aren't possible because of the constraints around them. And I think that without having language and intent around what it means to really design systems and organizations that can adapt, we're not successful with that. I also believe that people aren't rational actors, that they respond to safety, trust, meaning, status, all these different things. And so having the right answer is about 1/3 of the problem. Figuring out how to engage people in it becomes even more challenging. And I think there's an interesting aspect of strategy versus product development. In the agile world that we were in, product development, it was relatively easy to point at the customer and solve a customer problem and use that as your focal point. I think in strategy, there's a lot of politics and a lot of competing concerns and a lot of different players at play. I think that people competition becomes even more interesting in this next phase of where we're going with agile strategy. And so I'm going to talk about leadership not being about setting direction, but creating the conditions to make strategy possible. And I'm not going to talk about strategy as an aspiration or a plan, but as a system that's designed for coherence under pressure. I do believe we're at an inflection point where we saw strategy was able to operate to position your firm in the market to win today and position it for the future. We talked about moats, we talked about competitive advantage, we talked about really protecting your space in the market. And I think what we're finding is that those legacy assumptions around strategy being episodic, change happening occasionally, execution being about top-down control, trust as positional, people aligning themselves with enough direction. I think none of those are true today. And so the strategic realities are fluid strategy, constant change, execution is about moving rapidly, fragile systems are fragile, and people need structure to find coherence within those models. I think all of those things are true. There was a paper that I read about 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, called "The Underlying Theory of Project Management is Obsolete." And so I believe we're sort of in that place around strategy today, that our underlying theories are obsolete. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got underneath Agile, and then I'll talk about Agile strategy for a second. But Agile has become really widespread in response to rapid change, right? And what Agile brought about was a collapse of silos: product, project, program, business analysis, QA, deployment. We're all forced together by speed and complexity. We couldn't do these things linearly. It needed to be together. I think that collapse wasn't really a clean integration of these disciplines, though. I believe it was sort of emergent and messy and experimental, that it took a lot of trial and error. And I believe that it also led to us not really understanding why sometimes Agile things worked and why sometimes those things didn't work. One of the things that I built back about 15 years ago was a thing called the Big Agile model. And I drew it from Scrum, FDD, the BA BOK, all the QA stuff, critical chain project management, CMMI, OPM3, all these other ideas all being brought together. And I tried to build a core model of capabilities that would describe how Agile worked, what needed to happen. Because my belief was that these things needed to happen regardless of how they happened, and that there was a truth to what they would look like when they were successful, regardless of the practice. So by separating the why and the what we were doing from the how and the who, I was able to build a pretty robust model. And I got pretty good over time of determining what was going to work and what wasn't going to work. As a firm, some people still call one a previous firm, where we leveraged that model to go scale Agile in big, complex organizations, and we're able to achieve Agile results, even though we didn't always follow the practices. So the definition that I came up with for Agile at the time was the ability of a firm to respond at market speed sustainably. And underneath that, we had a lens about all these other interests that need to be represented, brought into a single entity. And we were able to analyze and move forward and create a coherent learning model for us around where Agile was going, and we could all learn together. And I believe that frame, that common basis, was really an important aspect of our ability to go lead transformations and be successful where a lot of other people weren't successful. There was an ability to get to a coherent understanding and align a bunch of interests because we had some common language around it. So I believe we're in the same place with Agile strategy. And based on the strategic realities, I formed the definition for Agile strategy, and that is the ongoing crafting of conditions most likely to produce your intended outcomes while maintaining structural fitness, civic resilience, which I'm still struggling with. I think I'm going to call it humanness a little bit later, and I'll explain that a little bit more, and adaptive capacity under pressure. So Agile was never one thing, it was a convergence. And I really like using the phrase Agile strategy because we're talking about the same sort of convergent moment in all the areas and all the lenses around strategy. So Agile strategy is the next evolution, a convergence of disciplines into an integrated system that can operate under pressure. It's not about speed, but it's about getting to strategic coherence organizationally, even as things move fast. So Agile transformed how we work. I believe Agile strategy is going to transform how we execute strategy. Now, I've based this presentation on the 4 segments of this definition. So I'm going to talk about the ongoing crafting of conditions, what it means, what it takes to create the conditions most likely to produce your intended outcomes. I'm going to talk about what strategic coherence looks like and how we actually go make these changes under pressure while the airplane's in flight. The first one is, what are we crafting? What does it mean to craft conditions? It is clear to me that what we can change in an organization is the actual design of the organization, who we are, how we organize, how we enable, how do we adapt. Those are our anchor points. And there's this quote from a guy named Dr. Russell Ackoff, who I learned from a long time ago, and I think he's informed my thinking so much, around your system is perfectly designed to get the outcomes that it gets, whether you did that on purpose or not. So we're talking about what systems do we need to design, because strategy becomes about becoming, about we have our aspiration, who we are, who we want to be, our strategic identity, our differentiator, where we're trying to go. And we need to actually build a system, organize, enable, and adapt to move towards that direction. One of the things that I'm going to lean into a little bit here is just the concept that who we are today is both a platform of potential, but it's also a constraint. This concept of personality and who we are, the concept that organizations have a way that they think about the world and they operate, and it's going to be something we can leverage or something that will constrain us as we move. So if we want to become a strategic organization has to be designed with our goal in mind of being strategic, but it's not a blank canvas. It includes our aspiration and our personality. There's some really interesting work from a number of people that I've looked at. Eong talks about COD and Garage Doggy. There's a bunch of interesting science around what it means to design organizations that are coherent under strategy, that some of it I learned from, but some of it reflected my experience and what I was understanding. So they mirrored each other. One of the things that I'll talk a little bit about or introduce here is just the concept of the interaction of structure here and psyche, the people in the system. And those two things have to be balanced. So I'm going to bring out a part of psyche. Alistair and I think Alistair might be on the call, did a talk 3 or 4 years ago. It's actually a set of talks, 2 talks. We talked about system versus psyche. And what we actually landed on is that the structure and the psyche co-create the future inside of the environment that you're in. As we're designing organizations, we're crafting organizational systems that actually move towards a goal and take into account the humanness, the goals, and the environment that we're in. So the aspiration at the top and then the lower layers, organize, enable, and adapt, aren't just operational. This is what goes into organizational design, and they're the levers that we use. We can't do emergent things as leaders. We can aspire to emergent things, but the organizations we build and design produce those things. If strategy is the ability to move at the speed of the market as a firm, we have to get really good then at designing our organizations so they can adapt at the speed of the market. Most likely to produce your intended outcomes, just like I did with Agile a few years ago, where I built that shared frame to sort of cut through the noise of practices and brands, the underlying actual capabilities that existed regardless of how we implemented them. I've done the same across strategy, portfolio governance, product thinking, leadership models, sensing systems, execution structure. And I've tried to pull together a synthesis of a frame that talks about strategy not being one thing, but it's the convergence of a number of things. I call it a little bit of the blind man and the elephant idea. What is strategy execution? What should it be? How do we talk about it? And again, if we don't have a frame to talk about the underlying physics of strategy execution, a way to share it, we might end up with a bunch of fragmented examples and case studies where something worked somewhere because some condition existed, but we're not really clear why it works one place and why it doesn't work another place. So I think this model of the capabilities that underlie strategy execution, it's very useful in looking at an organization and going, you've got to get good at these 5 things and their relationships. I went and listened to all 26 of the talks that have been given by the Agile Strategy Meetup group, and I found that most of the practice things we talked about can fit into this set of containers. But I think it's important here. I want to warn against turning this into a maturity model, because it's not a maturity model. Maturity implies progression towards a single right way, and that's what we saw with RUP and SAFE and some other things that actually didn't work well. I'm advocating that these are a basis for language that leads to craft. When we understand the capabilities, intent, and physics so well, we can express it fluently in multiple contexts. So it's not a recipe. We're not designing responses. It's principles first fluency that I'm talking about around this capability view. But I believe that these are the right capabilities, and this is the right model to start that conversation around. So what are we crafting? We're crafting organizations, and we're elevating craft in these capabilities within the organization so it can execute strategy more effectively. One of the really critical things about this is that organizations are messy. And there's 3 legs to a stool of what I'm calling strategic coherence. There's the structural fitness, there's the adaptive capacity, and then there's the humanness. Together they form sort of a stool. Remove one and the system leans or it collapses. Let me just walk through those real quickly, sort of lay a framework. But structural fitness is the architecture of coordination. It's the roles, routines, decision rights, information flow, and its boundaries. It's what gives form to execution, how we know who does what and how things move. Structure is necessary, even in dynamic human-led organizations. There has to be sufficient structure around an organization in order to hold it together. Complete lack of structure, and we've seen this in some examples, some agile examples where they were completely adaptive, completely human-oriented. They might have worked for a while, but they don't hold together over time. There needs to be a sufficient amount of structure in organizations, but it also becomes the lever that's destructive when we focus on structure over adaptability or humanness. Structure becomes problematic. So what is the dial on that? And what's interesting is there's a bunch of people we can talk to and a bunch of research that's been done and a bunch of experience people have had, guys like Akoff, Rajadagi, Young, and the CDE model. We know how to talk about structure to support adaptability with humans in complex systems. So that's been done, and we've practiced some of that. So there's some underlying theory and practice underneath that. Adaptive capacity is the ability of a system to sense, interpret, and adjust. That's where your feedback and your learning, your strategies evolve, not pivot recklessly, but evolve. And with adaptive capacity, when the circumstances change, when our understanding was proven to be incorrect, when risks occur or new opportunities arise, we have to have the ability to adapt both our structure and how we manage our people to move in the right place. And people like Dave Snowden, who was on this stage and is brilliant in this area, understands the concept of adaptive capacity and how to find what people are thinking, that connection. Dave was in the Lean Systems Society along with some of us, and I got to see some of his thinking up front, up close. Donella Meadows talks about it. Mike Burrows, who was on this talk as well, talks a lot about adaptive strategy rhythms and ways to create adaptation. And then the last leg on this is humanness. And this is really interesting. It's like the most referenced, but the most under-designed. We talk about respect for people in Lean. We talk about psychological safety and Agile, but very few people actually have any practice around how to go do this. But the truth is, humanness isn't soft. And if we have our feedback cycles and our structural fitness in place, we can actually design for emotion, status dynamics, trust, and identity so that the organization holds together. If we don't design for it, people will just ignore your system, resist it, or disengage entirely. People like Flores and Argyris and Lengione and Garajadagi have all talked about this model. And they also talk about the tensions between them. Adaptability brings responsiveness, but it has to be aligned with people. We have to invite people to change, not tell them to change. And the structure has to support adaptability. Human animates the system, but it needs guardrails and support and safety in order to participate. When one of these is missing or gets undervalued, we overcompensate by overloading the others. What's important about this frame here is it gives us the ability to talk about, why did that safe implementation work? Why did that RUP thing work? Why did that agile work? Why did that teal work? And these others didn't. And we can often find that we missed a leg of the stool pretty significantly. Or we over-indexed on one pretty significantly. Safe and RUP often failed because it was structural oriented and didn't leave room for adaptability or humanness. Some of the agile implementations or teal organization things fail when adaptive capacity or structural fitness are not paid attention to. Having this frame and then understanding what works and what doesn't is a really valuable tool in having this conversation. So what does it mean to do this under pressure? Wrote a paper for Microsoft 20 years ago called Rebuilding the Airplane in Flight. And it was about services-oriented architecture. And we were talking about, how do you, A, use the concept of capabilities to isolate the technical functionality that supports operations or strategic advantage? And how do you align the organization with those technologies? So we use services-oriented architecture principles, both around the technology and the operations of an organization, to redesign it to be able to continue to be competitive. So we need to be able to do this now all the time. So this execution by design, the principles and practices, on the left-hand side, my principles, capabilities are the unit of change. We can look at organizations. Capabilities remain relatively stable over time. Their strategic importance may vary as value migrates from one area to another, but the capabilities themselves stay relatively stable, and we can be intentional in analyzing the value, the strategic value of those capabilities. We can understand how they need to perform and what success looks like, do it completely separate from the actual execution inside of it. It gives us a framing to have stable conversations around boundaries and containers. The decisions as commitment cycles is also interesting. Designing for our ability to understand what's going on, make sense out of it, and pivot requires a lot of clarity on the consequences, the context, the intent of what we're going and how it stays aligned. This concept of sensing, framing, committing, and recohering becomes really important. But we can design in our organizational structure where decisions take place and who should make them, or who should be in the room to make them, and how we get the right consequences and context in time for those decisions made. One of the things that really helped us make Agile work very, very well at scale in big organizations was getting the right decisions made at the right time. So rather than waiting till the end to see if we understood the design, we would write tests on the front end and talk about them to agree on that design. And as we got to the back of the model, we didn't test at the very end. We tested as we went. So this concept of feedback as insight-driven design couples with decisions as commitment cycles, because when you make decisions and what information you have and the consequences of decisions is actually driven by feedback and the system. So if we design our organizations to get the right feedback at the right time to make the right decisions, and where those responsibilities lie, we can create a lot of safety, but within a relatively dynamic, changing, adaptable, humanly coherent structure. So we're balancing those three legs of the stool in these design principles. And then routines and the mechanisms of adaptation. Routines aren't just meetings, they're the actual civic infrastructure where we can come in with different ideas. There's ways that we resolve it. We encode purpose, judgment, and learning and change into the interactions that happen across this structure with these design decisions and feedback cycles. Now, what's important about the stuff on the right, I'll go through it relatively quickly. FEDAR is a model. It's frame, engage, design, activate, and reinforce. It's a very intentional change management model that we can use to design, implement, invite participation in, activate, and learn from, reinforce. It's actually a Kanban flow that we can use to move routines across in an almost ongoing fashion, because you don't do it once. As conditions change, you might go back and reframe things. You're always testing for a lack of coherence or a lack of viability in the model. And when you find a break, you might go back and redesign either the capabilities, where the decisions lie, the inside information you need, the routines. But again, this gives us a structure, a set of principles and practices to go implement strategic execution into an organization and do it under pressure. So this is where we are now. Strategy is not an aspiration or plan you write down and hand off. It has to be a system you build and evolve from the inside. And the work of strategy is about cascading intent, holding people accountable. It's about designing execution so intent can hold together and move across context. I believe strategy execution is the new core competency of the firm, not project management, not delivery, not vision, not design, execution as a living, coherent system. And for companies that can't design for coherence, who can't hold the structure, adaptability, and humanness all together, they're going to find themselves drifting, becoming rigid or fragile under the pressure and speed that's happening. But for those that can, we're going to be able to respond without breaking, to grow without losing their soul, and to move with clarity, even when conditions are unclear. So that's the system that I'm working on trying to design and share, and then use it to understand what's working, what's not, and why it's not, and what we can do about it. Make these things be actionable and practical in reality. And just my closing thought is the only viable, sustainable, competitive advantage is the ability to execute strategy. So that's my 30-minute talk. I think I nailed it right at 11:29. I had a couple more minutes in there. I was trying to hit the 30-minute window there pretty well. And this is like a quote that's in my signature. The art of leadership lies in envisioning a future for prospering and uncertainty and crafting the conditions to turn it into reality. This model is an attempt to do that around strategy execution. Yeah. Thanks, Morten.
Thank you. I was just about to say that this was exactly 27 minutes and 2 seconds, but that's no longer true. Thank you anyway. Appreciate the timekeeping.
So here's like the 4 big ideas that I put in there. And I'm interested, does the idea that strategy is converging resonate with this group? Does the idea that making it work is a organizational design, and that having structures and some reference frames to have these conversations is useful? I'd be interested in like a conversation around those concepts.
Absolutely. I can open with one perspective. So listening to your presentation for the first time, I was trying as good as I could to hang on, and the thought that came to my mind was, I mean, what is it that happens here? And the shift that I saw, which actually is something that I learned from Dave Snowden, but others have seen the same thing, is that there seems to be a shift from driving value to avoiding failure, meaning that the latter becomes more important. Staying out of trouble becomes more important than doing what you set out to do, because that might actually change in the process. So in that sense, in the first thing, when it's value, what happens is that you have some requirements that you want to implement for delivering future value. What happens in the second case is all of that, and you need to pay a lot of attention to the weak signals, the tensions, or the surprises that you meet on the way that might undermine even the strategy you set out with in the first place, which is why you need the adaptiveness. And I was wondering if you agree to this line of thinking, how is that framed in how you think around this? I mean, how do you activate this and take it for a spin? What is it what's the water on the mill?
Yeah, there's 2 important concepts. I'm going to talk about them independently. The first one is the place that happens is inside the set of capabilities around clarify and steer, which is understanding the market. Where's there a lack of coherence? So there's 2 things I care about: viability and coherence. Am I still doing something that's going to make a difference and position me for success? Mm-hmm. And am I moving in that direction in a way that will hold together and actually be successful? So
Yeah.
viability and coherence. So our steer capabilities, our clarify capabilities have to be looking at that and paying attention to that. But let's say that we identify a gap now, a break. What do we go do about it? And that to me is the piece that's kind of missing in some regards. And what we need to go do about it is an organizational design and leadership shift. We have to go change our teams or
Yeah.
our routines or our
Yeah.
measures or our beliefs. So try
Yeah.
to connect that together. So I think that you're correct a little bit, but it's not about avoiding failure versus doing what we set out to do. It's about doing the most practical thing for the success of the firm. So it's not
Yeah.
prioritizing one over the other. If what we set out to
Yeah.
do is the right thing to do still, it's still viable, we should be
Yeah.
able to be good at doing that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
as soon as it's a bad idea or we can't get
Yeah.
there, we need to
Yeah.
pivot one or the other.
Yeah. I
There's an
allow myself
interesting
to.
saying. There's an interesting saying from the Swiss Army uh, military guide. It says, "When lost in the forest and the map does not agree with the terrain, in every case, believe the terrain." Right. So when you're on maneuvers, it's really important to know whether you're
Yeah.
going to the right place, but also if the
Yeah.
terrain allows you to get there.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Allowing myself to just take one more, and then we will open up. So there was one thing that intrigued me that you talked about strategy execution being more dominating. You can say it's a bit of a shift from the what to the how. The approach becomes important, and I think that might contain a significant implication for the art of change management, because normally the idea in change management is that you are being changed. But actually, I would argue, and I love to hear your view on this, is that if you accept that it's a shift from the what to the how, then actually it's more like you are the change as part of the how, which just
Yeah.
completely changes around the whole idea of change management as a discipline. Any thoughts of that?
Yeah. For the last 15 years, I was engaged with some of the people that's called over 120 large scale agile transformations. Companies like major Fortune ones and uh, large automotive companies and military defense contractors, like big complex companies, and lots of other banks and things like that. Um, One of the things that we found is that change management practice wants to be separate from agile or transformation or strategy. My belief is, and for 15 years we've been practicing this, change management is embedded inside of transformation. It's embedded inside the model. So this Fedor model that I talked about,
Yeah.
frame, engage,
Yeah.
design, activate, recohere, or reinforce, is absolutely a change management model, but it's built
Mhm.
into how leaders lead their organizations
Yeah.
to do
Yeah.
this work.
Yeah.
So it's not a separate external thing. It's got to become part of what's wired into just basic leadership. And I think we've got some experience in making that happen. And I think these
Mhm.
models sort of um, align with change management being an integrated, collapsed, synthesized practice, not an external standalone
Yeah.
practice.
Thank you. There was one question just about at the end of your talk from Jardina, which was online. Jardina, do you want to ask it yourself?
That was just a small question that was in context about because you had talked about testing as you go. So I'm curious about what testing looks like for something like this.
Yeah. So let's look at that. I'm going to go put these teams together with the intent that they're going to reduce the the number of errors that are made in solving this problem for this customer. So I'm going to go build this team. Rather than write that up, hard code it, put it in place, and just assume that it's working, we ought to then go measure it and validate that we're getting the result that we intended. And if not, come back and realign it. That concept of always testing for viability and coherence around our designs is critical. So I would, um, we're going to pivot this organization to focus more on, I'll give an example for a company, say it's a wireless cell phone company that's trying to move into 3 new markets. introducing voice over IP and some music players and some things like that. It'd be very interesting as you started down those strategic paths and started designing your organization around it to have in place ways to test the viability in the market early before you made huge investments and it didn't deliver, or test the organization's ability, the assumptions you made about the organization's ability to go build that thing, and verify that frequently, because otherwise you're wasting scarce time and you're not actually making progress towards your strategic goals. Does that example resonate with you, Jardina?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we're pretty good at testing whether or not customers want something, right? We're not good at testing whether or not we're capable of delivering them,
That's right.
right?
Yep. That's right. Although not everybody's good at testing whether the market really wants what we decided either.
Well, true, true.
You were in that instance, but not everybody was great at it. Although the
Right,
music player, I think, was an example of where it wasn't well tested.
right, right. There's just a lot of thinking and writing about that. But when you're when you're creating strategic execution capability, um, I don't know that there's a lot of thinking that I've heard before I've talked to you about how to do that iteratively.
So when I go through that shape phase, part of shape is shaping the work and the validation and the organizational change that you're making around the strategy and making it measurable. And then we're setting up those tests and paying attention to the viability and the coherence tests that you put in place. So you've got things happening around it. One of the things that we'll find over time, by the way, is things like uh, AI and ML will make understanding some of these tests even easier and easier. We know we can point it at customers now and learn about the market and the customer. We're not doing it as frequently internally, but we have a ton of data about whether we're actually making progress or delivering the things that we said we would. We should be testing for coherence more internally as well and defining those measures.
Yeah, I think that's the big one of the big breakthroughs here. Being able
Yeah,
to
thank you.
link that information together, right? Hey, while I have the floor, I have one other question. Um, and you and I have talked about this a lot. I guess I love the ideas in this, Dennis. What I'm concerned about is, or how might we, let's say, build a doorway for people to walk through into it? Because, I just wonder if organizations I work with just don't typically have the maturity, the patience, the interest to think at this level. It's sort of, they really want the shoe prescription to start with. And maybe there is one
Yep.
to get them through the doorway.
Yeah, I do think there's a base camp type model um, to escalate towards this maturity. There's like an outside in sort of model. And we've talked a little bit about that before, about what it looks like to have this happen from a center, like a PMO or a center of excellence, or do it. So there's an iterative model that continuously improves this and moves decisions closer and closer to the work surface while improving your feedback cycles on it. And I do think that's possible. And we've actually done that in a few places. I also think there's an incremental approach to it where you could take and try some of this. Maybe it's not necessary to be super adaptive in all parts of the organization. As a matter of fact, that was one of the things we learned with business architecture and the SOA work that we did at Microsoft. There were probably 3 or 4 or 5 things that were really important to be really adaptive at. And the rest of the organization could sort of, as long as it wasn't consuming unreasonable amounts of resource, could sort of not be that adaptive. And so I think that you can do this incrementally as well. Take a big project or a major initiative or a program that needs to shift to reposition for strategy and apply this around that and call it project recovery. Call it execution, not strategy execution or something fancy, but make it be something that's very palatable. I didn't use that doorway with this group because this group is so advanced in their thinking. I thought they could actually help maybe explore some of those entry points or how it would matter. It's interesting. I see Tom Gilbs on the call, and Tom and I have met a few times, but it's been probably 15 years or so. But one of the things I always thought about Tom has the most brilliant work, insightful, thorough, rigorously defined work in the marketplace, but it's not always easy to get through the front door with it. So it'd be actually interesting to get Tom's thought about how to get through the front door with some of these concepts.
I'm here.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on it? Do you agree that sometimes it's hard to take your advanced, really deep, really, really accurate information and get it through the front door of organizations, and how do you overcome that?
Okay. By the way, I'm speaking from my car, so limitations here. But uh, uh, yeah, the whole of my competitive engineering is too much for anybody, anytime, even the best of people. So I don't do that. I'll give you a very simple example. In the first meeting with the top management of a client, I focus on something they think needs to be improved. Doesn't matter what it is. Let's say they want more security. I show them that they have been bullshitting it with nice sounding phrases, but they've never made any clear statement of what they want. And in that same hour, we quantify what they want, like, 10% more security for hacker invasion. We then also take a look at a very short-term evolutionary step, which might give some results, like do X strategy for security next week and see what happens. In other words, the simple in the door version is show them how to clarify something that they want to improve in, show them that there are short-term practical ways of doing something, and show that it works the next week. And I have case studies of doing that in very large organizations, for example, some of the aircraft manufacturers that you mentioned.
That's helpful, Tom. Yeah, so I think in a public facing way, Agile didn't get in the door up front by coming in and trying to redo every major project. It came in for software development projects that needed to operate really, really quickly, that needed a lot of adaptability. So they got narrowly focused. SOA didn't come in the door as a complete reframe. Microservices today as a complete reframe. It came in the door for those areas that needed a lot of adaptability. So I think that this would have to be framed as an execution framework for high pressure situations. And I think that might be more attractive than sort of the theory underneath it, Jardina. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. But I would just add, like, for good or for bad, Agile came through the front door with Scrum and then sometimes got stuck there. That
Right,
it's easy for people to just say daily stand-ups. We're doing daily stand-ups, right?
right.
But then there's a danger of that too.
Yep. Brian, who's on this
Mm.
call, and I actually bought a URL one time called I've got a SOA. I've got an SOA because every CIO and CTO in the Fortune 500 was charged with getting a service-oriented architecture in place. And so we were going to build a certification program and charge $10,000 for a certificate that said I've got a SOA, because that got us in the front door for things. Actually, Brian was a customer, but I
Okay,
thought
yeah.
that was relevant, but kind of funny. We need a SOA or a Scrum or some sort of a tagline that makes it interesting. But it's just, in my mind, this is just true. This is where it's going. And I think having a coherent frame for people like us to talk about it and agree on the model is useful. And finding the front door then is a secondary thing. But if we approach this in a fragmented, not aligned sort of way, I don't think we'll make the progress that we can in the industry by having a common language and a common scaffolding for what it means to actually go execute strategy effectively. I'd love to hear from some other people what their thoughts were, takeaways, or if this was worth listening to or what was interesting. What do you think, Jens?
Thanks. I like the concepts in your frame uh, because that resonates with me.
We could. I went back and tried to map all 26 of the previous talks against either the coherence frame or the capability view or the org design view. And I found very few holes in the 26 talks that I couldn't map to the underlying structure. And when that's strong, that gives us the ability to talk about it and improve. Like, I think having a framework is useful as long as we don't turn into a maturity model, we use it as a coherence framework. So I'd be interested in understanding if anybody else found value in that.
So I think, Dennis, I would have to digest it one more time, potentially hold back a little bit by having put my own thoughts together. So I simply need a little bit of time, but I'll come back to you. So definitely recognized all the words. It's a matter of how you decide to combine them. And I would say it's even a question, do you need to combine those? So I probably didn't do much justice to idea of hexes, but I had some fun simply putting the important things on hexes. And I discovered interesting combinations I hadn't thought of just by putting those things together. But also from that, some more fundamental things emerged. So, for example, you had your view on what is strategy. I landed on an idea that the essential form, not purpose, but the essential form of strategy is aspiration and action together. One doesn't have meaning without the other. And then there can be more or less useful and even complete meaningless such combinations. But in any useful notion of strategy, you will see that combination. You made a different analysis and made a different conclusion. So it would be interesting to compare notes.
Yeah, I think that you can and those two things together, that the concept that the actual act of strategy is building a system that can connect aspiration to action.
Yeah. So and I came across a really interesting thing by Christian. He's the next speaker in the line. He's actually already lined up, a Swedish researcher who has been looking at strategy in a public sector. And he had some really useful ideas on what's the job of the strategist. So the job of the strategist is to anchor initiatives. It's to build the networks in the organizations, etc. And he just had a useful way of looking at it a little bit differently and thinking of, you mentioned yourself that the difference between product management, customer-driven development versus strategy development is strategy development is highly political. But essentially it is a kind of a product management role to chaperone and take good care of the strategy, both during creation and whatever other roles it serves. So I also think, like you said, there's a lot of these things actually coming together in a more integrative way that you simply cannot separate one meaning fully from the other.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Anyway,
Moosna, you had a question?
Yeah. I have a question about strategy timelines. I really like that you mentioned something to do with humanness. It's the people execution that drive this. So timeline-wise, execution is a long stretch a good thing, assuming the structural infrastructure is solid, or it doesn't matter?
Yeah, so I think what's important is being able to sense the friction, the lack of coherence, and know when you need to adapt the humanist side. But if people don't participate in designing their future and don't understand the reasons why it's operating that way, if we don't engage them before we do the design and the activation, and if we don't make activation an invitation but make it be a dictation, you're going to keep people from wanting to participate in the structure. So addressing the humanness is not really optional. It has to be done effectively. I think that the process of continuous design engages the people frequently. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I'm just thinking out loud. Then that provides evidence for why they need to be part of the transformation, if I can use that word.
Yeah, that's right. And it needs to be measurable. We need to actually measure things that matter to them, not just to the people that are paying for the transformation. So when you look at those three stools of coherence, humanness, adaptability, and structural fitness, we can actually measure those, and we can identify whether or not they're holding together. And it's not soft, it's not undefined, it's not even new. Like, these are things that people know how to do, that have been documented and in practice for a long time. So when we start to get friction on the humanness side, or the structure starts to be in conflict with the adaptability, and we're not able to respond to change, or we're not able to deliver what we said we would, or people start getting unhappy, it's time to go back, reframe it, re-engage, redesign, activate the new hypotheses, and then recohere and enforce those changes. So that leadership model around the theater is an important part of bringing people into the play.
So doing it in a loop, you would say, is good?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Or off a set of triggers as you're measuring. I think that retrospectives in Agile try to do this. I think operations reviews in Lean try to do this. Like, there's intention there. And what I'll tell you is that when operations reviews or retrospectives work, it's because they're paying attention to all three legs of the stool. And when they don't work, it's because they're focused just on one aspect or another.
Thank you.
All right. Gina, you got anything to add? It's great to see you, by the way.
Good to see you too. I'm getting everything off here. Thank you. No, I don't. I've enjoyed the discussion. I don't work in Agile so much, so I'm around it because I work on the organization design. So I really appreciate hearing the perspective and experiences. So thank you all.
So Dennis, I have one last thing for you then, if we still have a few minutes, and I'm not sure exactly how to phrase this question, and I'll leave a few minutes for you to round off if there's anything more to add. But so what I have seen, I had fun looking at the Scaled Agile framework, because it's a little bit like strategy is outside and everything begins with strategy. And then it gets turned into strategic themes that then drives whatever you do in Lean, portfolio management and budgeting and all of that. But it's a bit like the strategy is a given. And listening to you, I think there's still a lot of the words you use that takes it as a given. I mean, it's what defines the value. It's what we do, and we need to then mend everything else to make it happen. We need to fix the implementation. I'm a bit wondering what is that is actually wrong, meaning that the constant is not the strategy, but it's our approach to pursue value, whatever strategy that implies. So we need to be actually seeing the strategy as a variable, not a constant in the equation we are building. And I sense both ideas from you. Which do you believe is the strongest, or have you seen a change recently in whether it's like a constant or a variable, or how do you think about this?
So personality and differentiator are probably more stable than near term strategy, but the aspiration of who we intend to be, there is a set of persistence there, and then how we go about pursuing that can change dynamically. But I will also say that where those things exist in my view of the world, you have to have the capabilities that can establish those, test them, pay attention to them, identify when the viability is moving. All that stuff is inside of steer and clarify. There's capabilities that must exist. Strategy is not that aspiration. Strategy is the ability to marshal our organization to make those decisions and understand where we're going, and then communicate it, and then cohesively, coherently respond to it. So my shift is a little bit like where David was going, or some other people were going. David Snowden was strategy is the organization's capacity to become something. And part of that includes determining what to become. But I can't get better at an aspiration. I can only get better at things that my organization does. So if I need to get better at defining strategy, there's a set of capabilities that exist in my organization that I have to get better at. And those things probably need to get informed more and more frequently by what's actually happening on the ground, Mintzberg style, rather than what my analysts are telling me is going to happen 5 years out. And so we can go find those capabilities around determining strategic intent, determining strategic intent, and we can put a different set of characteristics around them and go see if they're happening. But to actually make that happen requires me to make changes in how my organization or my capabilities perform, not just having a better PowerPoint. Does that make sense? That distinction is an important one. That it's if I don't have a good strategy, it's because my organization isn't set up to produce good strategy documents, do good strategy analysis.
Yes, you answered my question. Thank you. So
Perfect.
A few minutes left. Any final question from anyone, or then is anything else we can do for you while we are here?
No, I appreciate the feedback and everything. And what I take away from this is, even being a little bit simplified, it still doesn't seem practical and applicable day to day, even for the strategist. I sort of thought the framing would be valuable for the people on this call that are looking to deal with this synthesis and collapse of ideas. And I thought the framing would be useful to the group. So it's interesting. I got to think about that a little bit more. Because I think if once we have that frame built, that we can go do implementations that are much more successful, and we can accelerate the synthesis that's going on. So that was kind of my intent. So I appreciate the feedback and the insights from the group.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
a
so
lot
much,
for
Dennis.
presenting.
All right, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Bye bye and thanks.
Peder kommit ut och han